The silence of the Vance ranch in 1887 was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, settling over the clapboard house like a second layer of dust, muffling the clink of a fork against a plate and the groan of the porch swing in the wind. For Nathaniel Vance, the silence was his father's doing, a monument built to the memory of his mother. It had been 6 months since they had laid Martha Vance to rest on the low hill overlooking the creek, and in that time, the space she had occupied with laughter and humming and the scent of baking bread had been hollowed out and filled with a quiet so profound it felt like its own kind of screaming. Nathaniel was 20, with his mother's deep-set eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He moved through his days with a sense of grim duty, his grief a constant, heavy companion. The ranch, once a place of shared purpose, had become a sprawling expanse of chores that separated him and his father, Owen. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching in unison, yet they might as well have been on opposite sides of the continent. They were two solitary planets orbiting a dead star, their paths parallel but never touching. Owen's grief was a fortress of stone, its walls high and impenetrable. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional, concerning fence posts, water levels, or the price of feed. He never spoke her name. Nathaniel's own sorrow was a different beast, a restless, pacing thing that clawed at him in the quiet of his small room at night. He missed the easy comfort of his mother's presence, the way she could soften his father's hard edges with a touch or a word, the way she had filled their small home with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Now, the house was just a structure, cold and echoing. The routine was their only language, the pre-dawn coffee brewed in tense silence, the long hours spent under the vast, indifferent sky, the evening meal eaten with eyes fixed on their plates. It was a life of resignation, a slow bleeding out of hope. He was checking the north fence line, a lonely stretch of wire that snaked through a landscape of unforgiving rock and hardy scrub, when he first heard it. It was a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the ceaseless Wyoming wind, a thin, wavering cry that was not animal. He reined in his horse, a sturdy bay named Anchor, and listened. The wind howled, a thing grieving for itself, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, weaker this time, a thread of sound nearly broken by the distance. He nudged Anchor off the familiar trail, his brow furrowed with a caution born of solitude. The land here was treacherous, dropping away into sudden ravines and gullies carved by millennia of spring melts. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the broken terrain. It led him to the edge of a steep, shadowed cut in the earth, a place where the ground simply fell away into a clutter of sharp rocks and tangled, thorny brush. And there, at the bottom, he saw it. A horse, its coat the color of dried blood, lay on its side at an unnatural angle, its legs jutting stiffly into the air. Pinned beneath its heavy torso was a figure, a person. A cold knot tightened in Nathaniel's stomach. He dismounted, his movements swift and sure, and tethered Anchor to a stunted pine. He carefully picked his way down the treacherous slope, loose scree skittering under his boots. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a scene of grim finality. The horse was long dead, its eyes glassy and vacant. The person trapped beneath it was a woman, her face turned away from him, her dark hair fanned out against the dirt. A length of her buckskin dress was torn, and one arm was flung out, the fingers curled loosely in the dust. He saw no movement. He feared he was too late. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. A slight tremor ran through her body. A low moan escaped her lips. She was alive. He reached the bottom of the ravine and knelt beside her. He could see now that she was native, her features finely drawn and smeared with dirt, her skin the warm color of fired clay. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. He gently touched her free shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open. They were dark, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but for a moment they held a spark of fierce, wary intelligence. Her lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He saw the way she was wedged, her leg trapped beneath the crushing weight of the dead animal. Dehydration, he guessed, and injury. She could not have been here for less than a day, maybe more. The task ahead was monumental and gruesome. He had to move the horse. There was no other way. He surveyed the scene, his practical rancher's mind taking over, pushing aside the horror of the situation. He had his rope, his strength, and the leverage of the steep incline. It would have to be enough. "I'm going to get you out," he said, more to himself than to her. "Just hold on." He didn't know if she understood his words, but as he stood to retrieve his rope, her dark eyes followed him, a silent, desperate plea in their depths. The unspoken communication passed between them, a fragile bridge of shared humanity in that desolate place. He was her only hope, and she, in her silent suffering, was a sudden, terrible responsibility that had fallen on him from the empty sky. The work was brutal. Nathaniel secured his rope around the dead horse's neck, the stiff hide resisting him. He scrambled back up the incline, looped the other end around the base of the pine tree, and began the agonizing process of using his own body as a counterweight, straining to shift the immense, dead weight even a few inches. His muscles screamed in protest, sweat stinging his eyes and soaking the back of his shirt. He hauled, grunted, and swore under his breath, his boots slipping on the loose rock. The woman below watched, her face a mask of pain. Inch by agonizing inch, he moved the carcass. It was a slow, grim victory, measured in scraped knuckles and burning lungs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he had shifted it enough. The pressure was off her leg. He slid back down the slope, his heart pounding with exertion and a strange, nervous energy. Her leg was twisted at a bad angle, swollen and bruised, but he ran his hands over it gently and felt, to his immense relief, that the bone did not seem to be broken. Her shoulder, however, was clearly dislocated, the joint sitting high and awkward. She winced as his fingers brushed against it, a sharp hiss of breath escaping her chapped lips. "All right," he murmured, his voice softer now. "Let's get you out of this ravine." Getting her up the slope was a new ordeal. She was weak, barely able to stand, and leaned heavily against him. He half carried, half dragged her, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, her arm draped over his shoulders. She was surprisingly light, like a bird with hollow bones, yet her resilience was palpable. She fought to place her feet, her jaw set with a determination that he found himself admiring. Every step was a shared battle against gravity and exhaustion. When they finally reached the top, they both collapsed beside Anchor, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. He offered her his canteen, and she drank, slowly at first, then with a thirst so profound it was painful to watch. Water trickled from the corners of her mouth, tracing clean paths through the grime on her chin. He knew he had only one choice. The nearest town, Prescott, was a full day's ride, and she would never make it. His own ranch was hours away, but it was the only shelter within reach. The thought of his father's face when he arrived with her sent a chill of apprehension through him. Owen Vance was not a man who welcomed complications. And this woman, a stranger, an Indian, was the biggest complication Nathaniel could imagine. He helped her onto Anchor's back, her body slumping forward against the horse's neck. He mounted behind her, his arms encircling her to keep her steady. As they started the slow journey home, he felt the fragile warmth of her body against his chest, a small, living ember in the vast, cooling landscape. He was riding into a confrontation he did not want, bringing a disruption to the silent, grieving order of his world. But as he looked back at the dark scar of the ravine, he knew he could not have left her there. His mother, Martha, would not have. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt he was doing something that was wholly his own, a decision made not from duty or routine, but from a simple, unadorned sliver of conscience. The lights of the ranch house were a pair of lonely yellow eyes in the deep velvet of the night when they finally arrived. Every bone in Nathaniel's body ached, and the woman, whose name he still did not know, had lapsed into a semi-conscious state, her head resting against his shoulder. As he dismounted and gently lowered her to the ground, the front door creaked open. Owen stood silhouetted in the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure whose shadow stretched long and accusingly across the dusty yard. "What have you done?" Owen's voice was low and flat, stripped of all emotion save for a weary disapproval. It was not a question so much as a judgment. "Found her in the North Ravine, pinned under her horse," Nathaniel said, his own voice tight. He supported the woman, who swayed on her feet. "She's hurt bad, Pa." Owen's gaze swept over the woman, taking in her buckskin dress, her dark hair, her exhausted, dirt-streaked face. His expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. He saw not a person in need of help, but a problem, trouble, an intrusion from a world he wanted no part of. "This is our home, not a mission for strays," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "She would have died," Nathaniel countered, a raw edge of defiance in his tone he had not used with his father in years. "I wasn't going to leave her." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other over the fragile body of the woman between them. It was a standoff between the rigid, fearful grief of the father and the burgeoning, uncertain compassion of the son. The silence of the house stretched to encompass them, heavy and fraught with unspoken history. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like the collapse of something old and tired, Owen stepped back from the doorway. "Bring her in," he said, the words grudging and clipped. "But any trouble she brings, it's on your head." Nathaniel carried her inside, the warmth and smell of the house wood smoke and old memory enveloping them. He laid her gently on the cot in the small spare room, a room that had not been used since his mother was alive. As he lit a lamp, the soft light fell across her face, and her eyes opened again. They were filled with pain, but also with a quiet, guarded dignity. "Winona," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was the first word she had spoken to him. "Nathaniel," he replied, the name feeling strange on his own tongue. He left a glass of water by the cot and went to the main room. His father was staring into the cold fireplace, his back rigid. Neither of them spoke, but the silence in the house had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of a stranger, a witness to their grief, and the quiet, simmering tension of a choice that could undo them all. Just as Owen had predicted, trouble was not far behind. It arrived not on horseback, but on the wind, carried as a whisper that grew into a rumor. A prospector passing through the high country must have seen Nathaniel's tracks leading away from the ravine, must have seen the signs of a second person. In a small, isolated town like Prescott, a mystery was a spark on dry tinder. The talk started in the saloon, fueled by cheap whiskey and ingrained prejudice, an Indian woman, missing from her people, found on Vance land. Speculation festered, turning her from a victim into a threat. Was she a scout for a raiding party? A thief? The very presence of an outsider, especially a native one, unsettled the fragile peace of the frontier community. Meanwhile, on the ranch, a tentative rhythm established itself. Winona's recovery was slow. Her leg was badly sprained, and she had a fever that came and went, leaving her weak and slick with sweat. Nathaniel became her reluctant nurse. He learned to reset her dislocated shoulder with a grim, practiced efficiency that shocked him, following her gasped instructions in a mixture of Lakota and broken English. He brought her broth, which she drank with quiet gratitude, and changed the cool cloths on her forehead. He did this all under the heavy, disapproving gaze of his father. Owen circled the situation like a wary wolf. He never spoke to Winona directly, referring to her only as the woman. Yet Nathaniel saw him watching. He saw him notice the way she kept her small space immaculately tidy despite her injuries, the way she mended the tear in her dress with thread she had painstakingly pulled from a discarded burlap sack, her stitches small and perfect. One afternoon, Nathaniel came into the main room to find his father standing by the open door of the spare room, just looking. Winona was asleep, her face peaceful in the afternoon light. Owen's expression was unreadable, a complicated mask of suspicion and something else, something deeper that Nathaniel couldn't name. As Winona grew stronger, the silence between her and Nathaniel began to fill with small, hesitant sounds. She taught him the Lakota word for water, nyand. He taught her the name for the bread. He clumsily baked a task his mother had always performed with such effortless grace. He found that her English was better than she had initially let on, her early reticence born of caution, not inability. She told him, in spare, carefully chosen words, that she had been separated from her family during a sudden rockslide while traveling through the mountains. She did not speak of where they were going or from where they had come. Her past remained a closed book, and he did not press. He understood the need for guarded secrets. He had plenty of his own. One evening, a fierce autumn storm blew in, imprisoning them in the house. The wind shrieked around the eaves like a lost soul, and rain lashed against the windows. The fire in the hearth crackled, a lone bastion of warmth against the tempest outside. Owen sat in his chair, sharpening a knife with rhythmic, grating strokes. Nathaniel was reading, and Winona was polishing a tarnished silver locket she wore around her neck. "My mother," she said softly, holding it out for him to see. "8. She pointed at the locket, then tapped her chest. "My 8 gave it to her. Father." Nathaniel looked at the small, oval object. It was worn smooth with time and touch. He thought of his own mother's wedding band, which now sat in a small wooden box on his father's nightstand, untouched. "She was a good woman," Nathaniel found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "My mother, she liked storms." Across the room, the sound of the whetstone paused. Owen's head was bent, his face in shadow, but Nathaniel knew he was listening. Winona nodded slowly, her dark eyes filled with a profound understanding that transcended language. "A strong heart," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. She had seen the ghost of Martha Vance in the way the house was kept, in the carefully tended geraniums still blooming on the windowsill, in the son who could not speak of his mother without his voice cracking. In that moment, the space between them shrank. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim, but two people who understood the shape of loss. The storm passed, but it had shifted something inside the house. The quiet was less tense, more contemplative, but the world outside had not forgotten them. The trouble, when it finally arrived in person, had a name: McBride. He was a local cattleman with a florid face and an oversized sense of his own importance, a man who saw the world in simple terms of property, power, and prejudice. He rode up to the Vance ranch one afternoon with the town sheriff, a man named Hale, whose authority seemed to be on loan from McBride himself. Owen and Nathaniel met them on the porch. Nathaniel's heart began a low, steady drumming against his ribs. "Vance," McBride said, not bothering with pleasantries. He remained on his horse, looking down at them. "Heard a rumor you're harboring a squaw." The slur hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Nathaniel felt a hot flash of anger. Beside him, Owen stiffened. "We have a guest," Owen said, his voice level and cold. "A woman who was injured. It's a private matter." "Not when it concerns the safety of this community," McBride retorted, his voice rising. "There's been livestock go missing over at the Sinclair place. People are nervous. An Indian woman shows up out of nowhere. It doesn't look good. We think it's best if she comes with us back to town for questioning." Sheriff Hale shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Just to sort things out, Owen. No trouble." Nathaniel knew what questioning meant. It meant a locked cell, intimidation, and judgment passed long before any facts were known. He saw Winona's face in his mind, a quiet dignity, her pain, the trust she had begun to place in him. "She's not going anywhere," Nathaniel said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "She's still recovering. She's done nothing wrong." McBride's eyes narrowed, focusing on Nathaniel as if seeing him for the first time. He gave a short, derisive laugh. "The boy's got a soft spot, it seems. "Listen, Vance, you can do this the easy way, or you can find yourself on the wrong side of your neighbors. This ain't a request." The threat was clear. Ostracism, economic pressure, maybe worse. Nathaniel looked at his father. Owen's face was a granite mask, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. For a terrible moment, Nathaniel thought he would yield. His father was a practical man, a man who believed in weathering storms by bending, not breaking. To risk everything for a stranger, it went against his very nature. "The boy is right," Owen said, his voice quiet but as solid as the foundation of the house. "The woman is under our roof, under our protection. She stays. Now, unless you have a warrant, you're on private property. I suggest you leave." A flicker of shock, then grudging respect, passed through Sheriff Hale's eyes. McBride's face flushed a deep, angry red. He looked from Owen's unyielding stance to Nathaniel's defiant one. He had expected a quick and easy resolution, an affirmation of his own power. He had not expected this united front. "This isn't over, Vance," McBride snarled, yanking on his horse's reins. "You'll regret this, both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, the sheriff following in his wake like a reluctant shadow. They left behind a silence charged with the promise of future conflict. Nathaniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked at his father, a question in his eyes. Owen didn't look at him. He just stared out at the trail where the riders had disappeared. "Go check on her," he said, his voice rough. "Make sure she didn't hear." But as Nathaniel turned to go inside, he knew Winona had heard every word, and he knew that the line had been drawn. The Vance Ranch was no longer just a place of mourning. It had become a sanctuary. And its defense rested on the shoulders of a grieving father and his son who had, in the space of a single afternoon, finally found a cause to stand for together. The days that followed were thick with a tension that felt like the heavy, charged air before a lightning strike. The Vances were now marked men. A trip into Prescott for supplies became an exercise in silent hostility. Faces turned away. Conversation ceased when Nathaniel entered the general store. The proprietor, a man who had known him since he was a boy, served him with a cold formality, his eyes refusing to meet Nathaniel's. The isolation they had cultivated in their grief was now being forced upon them by their community. They were pariahs. Back at the ranch, the unspoken alliance between the three of them solidified. Winona, now able to walk with only a slight limp, insisted on contributing. She took over the mending, her fingers nimble and sure. She showed Nathaniel how to find edible roots along the creek bed, knowledge that felt ancient and vital. She even began to tend to Martha's neglected geraniums, her gentle touch seeming to coax them back to a more vibrant life. She moved through their home with a quiet grace that did not try to fill the void Martha had left, but rather created its own unique space. One evening, Nathaniel found his father sitting on the porch, watching Winona as she scattered feed for the chickens. She moved with an economy of motion, a peaceful rhythm that seemed to calm the frantic birds. Owen was holding his wife's small gardening trowel, turning it over and over in his work-roughened hands. "Your mother," Owen said, his voice low and raspy. "She loved this time of day," said the light was honest. It was the most he had spoken of her in months. Nathaniel sat down on the steps, not wanting to break the fragile spell. "She would have liked Winona," Nathaniel said quietly. Owen did not reply. He simply continued to watch as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the yard, illuminating the woman who had brought such turmoil and, paradoxically, such a strange, burgeoning peace to their lives. He was seeing more than just an outsider now. He was seeing a woman of quiet strength and deep resilience, qualities he had loved so fiercely in his own wife. The prejudice that had armored his heart was beginning to crack. The final confrontation came without warning. It was just after dusk, a time of deep shadows and uncertain light. A dog began to bark frantically from a neighboring ranch, a sound of alarm that carried clearly on the still night air. Nathaniel felt a cold premonition. He went to the window and peered out into the gathering dark. He saw them, Thena, small group of riders, maybe 5 or 6, cresting the low ridge to the east. They were not moving with the easy gait of travelers. They were riding with purpose, dark shapes against a darkening sky. "Pa," he said, his voice tight. "They're coming." Owen was on his feet in an instant. He went to the mantel and took down the Winchester rifle that had hung there for years. His movements were calm and deliberate, betraying none of the turmoil Nathaniel felt churning in his own gut. He handed a smaller shotgun to Nathaniel. "Stay inside," Owen said, his voice a low command. He glanced towards the spare room where Winona had retreated at the first sound of the dogs. "Both of you." But Nathaniel shook his head. "I'm standing with you." The look that passed between them was one of complete, unspoken understanding. This was not just about protecting Winona anymore. It was about defending their home, their integrity, the very ground where their family was buried. It was about refusing to let fear and hatred dictate their lives. Owen gave a single, sharp nod. They stepped out onto the porch together as the riders entered the yard. McBride was at their head, his face flushed with whiskey and self-righteous fury. The men with him were a mix of ranch hands and town loafers, their expressions ranging from sullen to eager. They were a mob, stripped of reason and fueled by a collective, ugly certainty. "Vance," McBride bellowed, his voice slurring slightly. "We gave you a chance. We're done talking. Send out the squaw." "You're not welcome here, McBride," Owen said, his voice carrying with surprising force in the twilight. The Winchester rested easily in the crook of his arm, its long barrel glinting in the last of the light. "Turn around and ride out." "We're not leaving without her," one of the other men shouted. "This is decent, white territory." The mob grew bolder, fanning out, their intentions clear. They were going to storm the house. Nathaniel's hands were slick with sweat on the stock of his shotgun, his heart hammered against his ribs. He was terrified, but a strange clarity settled over him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not let them pass. He would not let them lay a hand on the woman who had, in her quiet way, begun to stitch their broken family back together. He raised the shotgun, the metallic click of the hammer being pulled back, echoing loudly in the tense silence. "You take one more step," he warned, his voice shaking but firm, "and I swear to God I will shoot." McBride laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Look at the boy, playing soldier. You ain't got the nerve." He started to dismount, his eyes fixed on the front door, as if he could already see his prize. And then the door opened. But it was not Winona who stepped out, it was Owen. He moved from the relative safety of the porch and walked down the 3 steps to stand on the ground, placing himself squarely between the riders and his son. He held the Winchester at his side, not aiming it, but holding it with an air of absolute finality. He was no longer a man hiding in his grief. He was the master of this land, a patriarch defending his home. "I will say this only once," Owen said, his voice low and lethal, cutting through the bluster of the mob. "This land is my land. The woman in that house is under my protection. My son stands with me. To get to her, you will have to come through us. I buried my wife on that hill. I will not have her grave dishonored by this kind of ugliness. Not tonight, not ever." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each man, his eyes as hard and cold as winter stone. "Now, weigh the cost," he finished. "Decide if what you came for is worth what you will leave in this yard." The raw, unshakable conviction in his voice hung in the air. The men looked at Owen, then at Nathaniel, then back at Owen. They saw 2 determined men, armed and ready to die on their own land. The drunken bravado began to curdle into uncertainty. This was not the easy victory they had envisioned. They were farmers and ranch hands, not killers. The price Owen had laid out, a price paid in blood and bodies, was too high. One by one, they began to back their horses away, their gazes dropping, avoiding McBride's furious glare. The mob was dissolving, its courage evaporating into the night. McBride, seeing his support vanish, was left sputtering in impotent rage. "Cowards! You're all cowards!" he screamed at their retreating backs. He shot one last venomous look at Owen and Nathaniel. This ain't forgotten. But his threats were hollow now. He was alone. With a final curse, he wrenched his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing the scene of his humiliation. Silence descended on the yard, thick and profound. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the ragged sound of Nathaniel's own breathing. He slowly lowered the shotgun, his arms trembling from adrenaline. His father stood for a long moment, his back to him, before turning around. Owen walked back up the porch steps. He looked at his son, his face illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the house. The hard mask of grief and anger he had worn for so long had finally crumbled. In its place was a weary sorrow, but also a deep, abiding pride. "Your mother," Owen said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have been proud of you tonight, son, so very proud." Tears welled in Nathaniel's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. The dam of unspoken pain that had stood between them for 6 long months had finally broken. They were not just a father and son bound by blood and a shared name. They were comrades, survivors who had faced down the darkness together and won. The door opened behind them, and Winona stepped out. She had heard everything. Her face was etched with gratitude and a sorrow of her own for the battle they had been forced to fight on her behalf. She looked at Owen, then at Nathaniel, and gave a slow, respectful nod. No words were needed. In the crucible of that confrontation, a new family had been forged, done conventional, unexpected, and unbreakable. The silence that filled the Vance home now was not one of loss, but of quiet strength and earned peace. In the weeks and months that followed the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the Vance ranch. It was not the oppressive, grief-stricken silence of before, but a peaceful, breathing stillness, filled with the small, comfortable sounds of a life being rebuilt. The town of Prescott kept its distance, a community nursing a grudge, but their hostility no longer felt like a threat. It was merely a fact, like the direction of the wind or the hardness of the winter ground. The ranch had become their entire world, an island sanctuary in a sea of judgment. The standoff in the yard had irrevocably altered the dynamic between father and son. The shared danger had acted like a fire, burning away the dross of unspoken resentment and leaving behind a purer, stronger bond. Owen began to talk again, not often, and never for long, but the words were no longer just functional. He would share a memory of the time she'd insisted on planting a rosebush in the rocky soil and how she'd coaxed it into blooming through sheer will. He and Nathaniel started working together again, not just alongside each other. Repairing a collapsed section of a barn roof became a collaboration, their movements synchronized, their conversation easy and practical, punctuated by shared moments of quiet satisfaction. The chasm of their mutual grief had not vanished, but they had finally built a bridge across it. Winona became the heart of their new, quiet life. Her healing was complete, leaving behind only a faint limp that was more pronounced when she was tired, and a web of fine scars on her leg that she bore with uncomplaining dignity. She never spoke of leaving. It was an unspoken understanding that this was her home now, for as long as she chose it. She brought with her a different kind of wisdom, one that was tied to the land in a way the Vances had never understood. She showed them which plants could be used for tea to soothe a cough, how to read the clouds to predict a coming snow with startling accuracy. She and Owen developed a relationship of deep, silent respect. He would watch as she worked, her hands gentle and sure, with the chickens or in the small garden she had started. He saw in her the same resilience and inner strength that had been the bedrock of his own marriage. She, in turn, seemed to understand his enduring sorrow without needing it to be spoken, offering him a companionship that demanded nothing. Her bond with Nathaniel deepened into a tender, unspoken affection. They were two solitary souls who had found a kindred spirit in the wilderness. They would walk along the creek in the evenings, the silence between them comfortable and rich. He would tell her about his mother, about the books she used to read to him, and she would tell him stories of her people, of the stars and the seasons. Her presence was a balm to the raw wound of his loss. He had found her, a woman pinned and broken, but in saving her, he had begun the long, arduous process of saving himself. She was not a replacement for the mother he had lost, but she had become a mothering force in his life, a source of healing and gentle guidance that had nurtured both him and his father back towards the light. One crisp afternoon in late spring, nearly a year after her arrival, the three of them worked together to plant a small apple sapling on the hill, not far from Martha's grave. Owen dug the hole, his movements steady and strong. Nathaniel lowered the young tree into the earth, and Winona carefully packed the soil around its fragile roots. They worked in a seamless, practiced harmony. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their work. The sapling was a thin, hopeful whip against the vast blue sky. It was a promise of future seasons, of growth, of life continuing. Owen looked from the sapling to his wife's simple wooden cross, then at his son, and finally at the quiet woman who stood beside him. A rare, gentle smile touched his lips. "She would have liked this," he said, and this time the words held no pain, only a quiet, peaceful acceptance. Nathaniel felt Winona's hand lightly touch his arm, a simple gesture of shared understanding. He looked at the home his mother had built, the home they had almost lost, and the improbable family that now lived within it. The grief for his mother was still there, a soft ache in his heart, but it was no longer a desolate emptiness. It was a space filled with love and memory, a foundation upon which they had built something new. He had been a son lost in sorrow, but in finding a stranger in a ravine, he had found a path back to his father and back to himself. The house was no longer silent, it was quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time in a very long time, there was the unmistakable sound of hope.